Blimey. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to my DrupalCon Europe 2020 session on render caching and lazy builders. My name is Joachim, and the source files and the sample code for this session are already available on GitHub, so you can follow along. The sample code is all in a custom Drupal module, which you can install and run. It's what I use to make the screenshots that we'll be looking at soon. My name is Joachim Nareko. I have a Drupal blog at nareko.com. You can find me on drupal.org as user Joachim, and on Twitter it's Joachim Nicholas, and I've been doing Drupal for ages. So let's get started. So this is all about render caching and lazy builders, but I'm going to start by covering some basic concepts to do with Drupal's cache API in general. The first one is cache contexts. So when we cache a piece of data, it's not necessarily universal to everybody. And the context is how we define how this piece of data can vary and who it's relevant to. The most typical context will be varying by user role and users. So the best way is, if we had to illustrate this, is if we have a particular piece of content that shows different things for different roles, like for example, an entity shows a particular field value or a particular label, but it's different for an admin, then we want more than one representation of this in the cache. And we define that with the cache contexts. So if user alpha goes to load a piece of content on the page and it has the user roles context, it'll be cached for that particular context only. And then if the next user comes along and has the same role, they'll be served that piece of cache. And if they don't have the same role, then it's a cache miss and it has to be generated all over again. And Drupal by default comes with a whole bunch of different cache contexts that are defined and handled for you. The user cache context, the user roles context, the route context. So we'll often have content that is different on different routes, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the session, I'll give you a link to the documentation page that explains all that. So cache context is a concept that we'll be working with a lot in this particular session. So another topic in Cache API is cache tags. We'll be looking at this a bit less, but I thought I'd cover it anyway. This is how you define when a piece of cached data becomes invalidated. So we cache things, we can give things a lifetime, but we can also say when a certain thing happens, this cached data is no longer valid and it should be discarded and it needs to be generated again. Most simply, we often depend our data on particular entities. And like with contexts, tags are just strings, and out of the box, Drupal comes with cache tags for every single entity. So the cache tag in the example node:5, if you apply that tag to your cached data, that just means that the data is invalidated anytime that node:5 is edited or deleted. So out of the box, the entity system knows that when it renders an entity and it caches the representation of that entity, that the cached data is dependent on that entity. If you go along and edit node:5, then a cached view of that entity is now invalid. And there's also a special cache tag, node_list, and you get one of those for every entity type as well. And that is invalidated when any node is edited or deleted, or when a node is created. So the best example of that is the out-of-the-box homepage /node that has a cache tag of node list. So anytime someone creates a new node, then the cached front page becomes invalid because there might be a new node to show on it. And equally, anytime someone edits a node or deletes a node, then the front page is invalid and has to be generated again from scratch. The entity system handles all of the entity-based cache tags for you, but you can also invalidate tags yourself using the cache tags invalidator service, and you can also define your own cache tags just by basically using a string and then invalidating it whenever that's relevant. by default, everything cached in the render cache receives some cache contexts, the languages and the theme and the set of user permissions. And that's something that's defined in Drupal. It's a parameter to the service container, so you can override it site by site. You probably generally wouldn't want to, but everything you cache will get those contexts by default. And there's also a definition in the service container as what counts as uncacheable, the auto placeholder conditions, which we'll see in a moment when we come to lazy builders. And dynamic page cache uses that setting and decides that things that are cached per user or cached per session count as uncacheable for the dynamic page cache module. And other things as well are using that setting. And again, that's a parameter that you can change. So these two things define what Drupal generally considers as uncacheable, and also the cache variants that Drupal considers the most basic. So everything generally, unless you declare something different, will have these two things running through it. And the next concept is lazy builders, which we'll be looking at mostly in our examples, and they're a way of deferring the rendering within a cacheable context. And that means that we can switch cache contexts within a page. So that's a lot of concepts. Everything is going to be made clear, hopefully, in the examples I'm now coming to. So we're going to start with a very simple example. Suppose that we want to show the user's name on a page. We want to say, hello, username. That obviously is not very cacheable because every single user who visits the page will should see a different username. So we don't want the whole page to be uncacheable. We'd like the page overall to be cached in the dynamic page cache, which is the module that Drupal has that lets you cache things for different authenticated users. So we need to use lazy rendering for the part that's user specific. And we're going to look at 3 different ways to do this, starting with the simplest and then moving on to the more complicated. So example 1A is we're going to use a block. The block system automatically uses lazy builders. If you declare a block as being not very cacheable, the block rendering system will use lazy builders for it automatically, and you don't even need to worry about that. So let's have a look at our first attempt at a block plugin. We've declared the block plugin with the annotation, we've got our block class, we've got our build method and returning markup that says hello with the current username. That looks fine, but there's a problem here because by default, cache contexts are language, theme, and permissions. And Drupal's dynamic page cache is going to cache this page with those contexts. So what's going to happen is this. User alpha is going to visit the site and they're going to see this page with the block. It says hello alpha. The whole page is going to get cached by dynamic page cache. User beta comes along. If they have the same roles as alpha, they count as needing the same cache because of the cache contexts. The caching system will go, oh, here's a person with the same theme, the same language, the same permission set. We have the cached context. They get served up the cached page that alpha generated. So user beta gets to see a page that says hello alpha. So something's gone wrong here. The fix is to declare the cache contexts of this particular block. So the block plugin interface has a method for this. Get cache contexts, and we return the user context because in our particular case, every single user should be seeing a different version of this content. I keep saying content and context mixed up. So every user needs to see a different version. So this is how we see cache contexts in action. It slices up the cache data to say this varies per user. User alpha sees one version of this, user beta sees another version of this, and so on. So we define that in the block plugin. While we're at it, we should also add the cache tag to say when this particular piece of content is invalidated. So here, it's simple. If the username gets changed, then this content is no good anymore. So there's the cache tag for a user that's provided out of the box by Drupal, user : and the user ID. So we implement this method in the block and then we're done. And what's going to happen is the render system and the block system work together and realize that this block is not well cacheable. And so the dynamic page content module and the rendering system will use a placeholder. So what's going to happen in the cache is we're going to see this. There's going to be an entry in cache dynamic page cache for the whole page, which has the whole markup for the page, except this one bit where the block should be, and instead there's going to be this special HTML tag, Drupal render placeholder. So the structure of this is actually fairly clear. It has the callback, which is a lazy builder inside the block view builder. The arguments you can just about make out are the block plugin ID, so that's the ID of the plugin I defined, and the second argument, full, is the view mode. And when the page is served from dynamic page cache, the render system spots this placeholder and it replaces this HTML tag with whatever the return of the lazy builder is. And here's the result. The green part of the page is come from dynamic page cache, and the red part is the block that's been rendered by the lazy builder. So we're now going to do this all over again, but this time we're going to do a render element, because blocks are great, but they don't give you that much layout flexibility. We might have a scenario where we want to position the hello username part more specifically. And so we're going to use the lazy builder ourselves. So this is the slide that doesn't fit on the screen, sorry. In our page controller, we now have the content method. So rather than define a block, we are defining a page controller. That's the callback for our root. In the content method, we have some dynamic content and some normal content. And the dynamic content, we simply define a lazy builder using the hash lazy builder attribute, and we specify the callback. And then we specify the cache context to say that this particular bit is cached only per user. And then in the lazy builder method, same as in the block, we just return the markup we want. So there's a gotcha here, which is you can specify parameters for the lazy builder, but they get cached. So don't make the mistake I once made, which is passing in parameters. Here it would be the user ID. Don't pass in parameters that depend on the dynamic part. And it's going to look pretty much the same in the cache, but now the callback is our callback. There aren't any arguments because we didn't use any. And the result is going to be this. It looks pretty much the same, but now it's not a block. It is the red part is just a div. I've got a question here about BigPipe. Yes, absolutely. BigPipe module will help. What BigPipe does is basically the red part is rendered right at the end, and inserting the red part is done with JavaScript. If you don't have BigPipe enabled, then the red part is inserted at the beginning. The green part is retrieved from dynamic page cache, the red part is added in, and then it's all served up. What BigPipe does is it serves up the green part with the placeholder still there, which will just be empty. And then the red part comes at the end of the HTML page as JavaScript. And then as soon as that runs, the JavaScript puts the red part in. I hope that answers the question. So yes, using lazy builders absolutely gets your site ready for use with BigPipe. And we can also, as an extra, we can also cache the lazy builder output. We wouldn't probably do that here because we don't really want to create a single row in the render cache for every single user who visits the site. But we'll see in a moment in a later example how we can do that. And we just do that by defining a cache key that we can make up, something unique. And then cache render will know to hold that. So we're now going to get a little bit more complicated. We're still trying to do the same thing. We're trying to show the username, say hello username on the page. We're going to go beyond the render element and we're going to do the placeholdering ourselves. So now we're going to explicitly create a token, which is a hash. It doesn't have to be a hash, it can actually be anything, but using a hash guards against accidental replacements. If our token was just a string like, you know, username, hello, or something like that, it could get accidentally replaced if there's other content on the page or in the render element that also has that string. So a hash just guards against collisions. So we've just created a token and we've put it straight into the markup, just inserted as a string. And then we used the hash attached attribute to specify the lazy builder for that placeholder. And this is going to mean that the static here, the bit that says this content is the same for everyone except where we say hello, all of that's going to go in the cache. And just the string that's the placeholder is going to get replaced. And our lazy builder method is the same as before. And now we don't have the special placeholder HTML element anymore. We actually just see the token. So here we've done it with a markup render element, but where this method is really useful is that you can pass it in as a theme variable. You can pass the token in, the placeholder, as a theme variable, and then insert it anywhere in your Twig template. And so this is something that I did on a project where I was retrofitting caching into an existing piece of content that had lots of templating and theme stuff. And rather than rejig it into render elements, the simplest thing was actually just to add an extra variable to the theme template and get my dynamically rendered lazy builder content right into the theme template where it needed to go. And here's the results. The green is cached in the dynamic page cache as before. And now we are just replacing this one piece of text with the lazy builder. So to mention big pipe again, if you had big pipe, you'd initially see everything in green except for the blank where the red bit would go, and then just the username would get loaded in with JavaScript. How are we doing for time? Right. So, just have a quick look at questions. How I entered the token string inside the div. I'll go back to here. I mean, you can look in it, and all of this code is in the GitHub repository. I basically just put it in. It's a string, so I just put it in the markup render element, hello placeholder, and then it goes in like that. Hello placeholder, hello, and then the token. And then because of the attached lazy builder, the render system knows that that particular string, the token, should be replaced with the contents of the lazy builder. Question about blocks. Is putting the cache context in the render array in the build method the same as implementing the cache context method? I don't know. I'm going to say probably. I'm going to say implementing the cache context method on your block is cleaner because it's where people are going to look for it, because that's the interface of the block plugin. Right. Moving on to example 2, we're going to get a bit more complicated here because we're still going to show the user's name, but for each letter of the user's name, we are going to show a box based on that letter. So if I had artistic talent, I would have made some pretty kind of calligraphic boxes with a letter looking pretty. I have 0 artistic talent, so instead each box is a word containing the NATO spelling alphabet. So for user alpha, it's going to say alpha, Lima, Papa, Hotel, Alpha. So the current username shouldn't be cached because it's unique per user. However, each of these boxes, Alpha, Lima, Papa, Hotel, that's not specific to the user. User beta has an A in their name as well, and they should see the same alpha box. So we want to cache the boxes as individual render elements, but they're within something uncacheable. So we have a caching strategy where our overall page is cached with the defaults, language, theme, user role, permissions. Our username render element isn't cached, where we figure out the letters we want to show. But then within that, we have some render elements, one per letter, which we do want to be cached. So we're slicing the page up into cacheable and uncacheable. So our sample code, this is going to be spread over several slides because it's quite bigger. To start with, as with the last example, we use a lazy builder for the render element. So here we've got the username render element using a lazy builder in the current class. And then just by way of an example, we have the static content that's the same for everyone. So that's the same as in example 1b, where we used a lazy builder for a render element. But now inside the lazy builder callback, we now, we're getting the username, we're splitting it up into characters. We're now going to hand over to another method, which we'll show in a moment, and we're creating a render element for each letter. So this is the uncacheable part. This code is going to get run for every single user when they load the page. Now, in the next method, we're creating a render element for a single letter. So you'll see in the sample sample code on GitHub, there's a bit of extra code here because there's CSS classes and everything to make it pretty, but here I just trimmed it down. We've got a container, which is going to create the div, and then we've got the markup for the letter, and then the crucial bit is the cache key. So I've made up a cache key here, which is just letter, hyphen, and the character. And specifying the cache key means that this particular render element gets cached. It's going to get cached with the default contexts, which are language, theme, permissions. Actually, we wouldn't mind it if it were cached with nothing, with a no context at all, because it should be the same for everyone. But we get the context we get out of the box. And this is going to look like this in the cache. In the dynamic page cache table, we're going to see our old friend, the Drupal render placeholder, with the lazy builder callback and the arguments. But in cache render, we're also going to see each letter box getting a row with the cache ID that's letter A, letter B, and so on. And it's going to have our div and our span and our content. So if you're paranoid about whether things are working properly, like I am, you can double check it's all working, clear your cache with Josh CR, reload, check what's been pushed in the cache. If you're really paranoid, you can hack your cache by changing a single letter and then load the page and check you're being served what is actually coming from the cache and not coming from the code. The result is going to be this. The green outer part of the page is served from dynamic page cache. Then the red box is the lazy builder that's figuring out the username depending on the current user. That's the bit that's not cached. That's running on every single page load. And then the inner part is the bit that is cached. Individually, each single letter is coming from the render cache. And I can't remember exactly how BigPipe is going to handle this when we start nesting things. The red part is all going to load in with JavaScript, and it's going to contain the green letterboxes inside it. And to finish off, I'm going to have so much time for questions. I'm going to show you an example of combining all these different cacheabilities in a real world scenario. So what we're going to do is we're going to imagine a site where customers have bought products, and on their account page, we're going to show them the products that they own, that they've bought from the site. So the overall page, we want to be cached, obviously, because we want to make sure we have good performance on our server. But each user has different products. Their particular list of products is something that's not cacheable. But then, if we show the user a div of their product with a product image and a brief description and links for support and whatever, that's the same for every single user. So it's the same scenario as our letterboxes. The actual product is a cacheable piece of content. just to make it even more complicated, within each product, we want to show the serial number of the actual item that the user owns. So then we've got something that's not cacheable. And this is how we want it to look. This is my account page. It's got a welcome message with my name. It's then got a list of my products. I own 3 products, and each of these gray boxes should be cached, because if another user owns the Cake Master 3000, they're going to see the same thing, the picture of the Cake Master 3000, the product name, the link to the user guide, the link to the drivers, the link to get started pages, and so on. Every user should see the same thing, and therefore we should cache it so we're not generating it every time, except for the serial number, which is there in the grey box. So we've got a bit of a challenge here. And this is going to be our caching strategy. The overall green part is the page as a whole, that is cached. The bit that's my name, that is not cached, that should therefore be a lazy builder. The red section below, which is my product list, is a lazy builder which loads up which products I own. Then each green box for a product is something that's cached in the renderer, in the render cache. And then the serial numbers are then loaded in with lazy builders. So we've got multiple lazy builders and nested lazy builders working here. So overall, we have the whole page that's cached with the default contexts. Inside that, we have the username that's inserted with a token placeholder lazy builder, because it's just one string, it's just my first name. Below that, we have a product list, which is a lazy builder, and that's uncached. Each product item is cached with default contexts in the render cache. But within that, we have another lazy builder that takes care of inserting the serial numbers with a token placeholder. And I've gone through this way quicker than I thought. So in conclusion, think about how cacheability varies across your page. Think about which parts are cacheable. Think about which parts vary per user, per role, and so on. Define the cache contexts for the different sections of your page, and then slice up your render structure in your controller classes using lazy builders to slice everything up. And then if there's anything within that, use render caching for caching within the lazy builders. So some resources. The presentation, this is the same link I gave at the beginning, is available online on GitHub. So all of the examples is in a custom Drupal module that you can install and run on Drupal 8 or Drupal 9. I think I did the screenshots on Drupal 9. So you can have a look at those. The documentation on the cache API on Drupal.org. And also on lazy builders, and then a couple of blog posts that are useful, and one of them being mine, that's specifically about using lazy builders, the token replacement technique using lazy builders in templates. So I guess there's plenty of time now for questions. So I have a question here from Dimitris about Varnish and Fastly. Yes, I started looking at using Varnish with this, and unfortunately my setup, I didn't get very far with Varnish at all. I couldn't get Varnish to work. But yes, BigPipe is supposed to work well with Varnish, absolutely. So yes, I mean, the way that BigPipe and lazy builders have been developed for Drupal 8 is absolutely in order to take advantage of modern techniques like BigPipe and modern caching systems like Varnish. So you should definitely use this approach in how you build your pages, how you build your render arrays, because it will pay off to declare your caching and your cache context, to slice things up with lazy builders. It will pay off over and over again when you implement caching. Have I tested performance of loading cached versus non-cached? Not for these examples specifically, but yes, for the real world example I showed at the end for my project, yes, we tested cached versus uncached, and I can't remember the numbers now, but yes, it made a significant difference. And then enabling BigPipe made it even better, because it meant that users saw a page appear within something like 5 seconds rather than 30, I think, so that kind of order of magnitude. We did have to do a bit of theming, because out of the box, BigPipe doesn't show you anything for what's coming. You just get a blank area. And in this example, people just saw welcome Joachim and then the links, but they didn't see their products. And so we, I think with CSS, we did something where there was just either a spinner or there was something that said, you know, please wait, your products are loading, or something like that. And you'll find examples of that on Drupal answers of CSS to show some kind of progress indicator. Federico asks whether we can use this for views output. I don't know how views uses lazy builders. Obviously, the views inside the block as a view is either going to be inside of a block. You can, I think, on a view you can define its cache contexts. So if you do that, then the view as a whole knows what its cacheability is. For each individual row of a view, I'm not so sure. If you're using the entity, entity display for each row, then each rendered entity knows its cacheability. I don't know whether your lazy builders get used per rows, sorry. There's a question from Jana about hook form alter. That I'm not sure. It sounds like there's a caching problem there. It sounds like you need to define a cache context in your form alter to make sure that the vanishes until the cache. I'm sorry, I really don't know. It sounds complicated, but it's going to be probably something to do with cache context not being declared, or could it be there's something to do with the form alter not being executed? I would add some logging to that form alter to check that it's actually executed, because, for instance, I know of a bug where if a module is in a sites folder, then it doesn't get executed, it doesn't get loaded on a cache clear. It could be that. So BigPipe blocks token string. If you have two tokens, Osman asked if you have 2 tokens in our markup. Yeah, you can have as many tokens as you like. If you have multiple instances of the same token, then they are all replaced with the same content, which is something fun I discovered when I was working on this, because when we had multiple serial numbers, initially we had we'd show the same product multiple times if you bought it twice. So we'd show the same box, and that was causing issues, and we had to rejig the page to show the product once only, with a list of serial numbers inside it. So yeah, the same token will get replaced with the same content over and over again, but you can have as many tokens as you want. Oh, someone's looked at the code already. Florent asks if there's the user cache context, why also put the user ID cache tag? So cache context and cache tags are very different. They might look similar as strings, because we have the user cache context. Let's go back and see if I can't remember if I put this in the example. So yes, so we have a cache context of user and we have a cache tag of user. Now these mean completely different things, even though they both say user. This says that the content of this block varies per user. Every single user should see a different version of this block, and that it is cached only for each user. So that means that the cache ID in the cache table will contain the user ID to say this particular row in the cache is unique to this user. It's unique to user 1 or user 2 or user 3. And if user 4 comes along, then none of these cached items are relevant to user 4 because they're for user 1, 2, and 3. Meanwhile, the cache tag says, when does this particular row in the cache table become invalid? And in this case, the cached row for user 4 becomes invalid when the user 4 entity is edited. So they mean very different things. One is to do with, if you imagine sort of parallel versions of the same content, and one is to do with when this context expires. I think the documentation says contexts are like space, tags are like time. Contexts are how this varies across space, whereas tags say when this content becomes invalid. On one slide, so Florent also asked, on one slide I showed that I did cache context on lazy builder results. Right, I'm not sure which slide. I think, as far as I know, it actually works. You can define the context either here on where you define the lazy builder callback, or I think it also works if you put it in what you return from the lazy builder. I'm not 100% sure. The best thing is to put it here so that the overall render array knows that this lazy builder, this bit is per user, and it knows it has to use the lazy builder there and create a placeholder. Cache is hard, yes. Caching is complicated. Yes, I can't remember not off the top, I don't know the issue number off the top of my head, but yes, there is a bug about things in a site folder. Helena says cache is fun. Yes, it's very, yes, caching is fun as well. I mean, when you figure out how best to slice things up and you vastly increase the performance of your pages, it's, yeah. And then seeing it work with Big Pipe, when you suddenly you load things up and boom, things come in later. Yeah, it's a great way of improving your server performance. So I think that's all the questions. Someone has linked an issue in the chat. So Florence says has the habit of putting the context in the lazy builder. I think it works as well. I didn't get around to trying both. I had a look in core for how lazy builders in core do it, and there's actually not that many examples of lazy builders in core. So I think that's everything. So we're gonna finish a little bit early, and we'll have some free time between now and the next session. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I hope it's been useful. And I'll see you at future sessions, and enjoy the rest of DrupalCon.